Look out now. This is Dizzy Gillespie, that is. And let me give you some information. If you want to hear some good sounds, the sounds that's round, keep your radio tuned to KDVS in Davis, 90.3 on your FM dial. Look out.
Look out.
Ow.
Come on, Richard. How about an ow? Give us an ow. Ow. Ooh, you sound almost like Wolfman Jack. This is Speaking in Tongues. I'm Ron Glick. We can do the ows, but we can't do that Dizzy Gillespie.
Playing the horn's a little challenging for us.
I just can't do it like Dizzy Gillespie. This is Speaking in Tongues on KDVS 90.3 FM in Davis. We're going to do a couple of things today. First, Richard has an author that he's going to interview, and he's going to tell you about the introduction of that in just a moment. And then later on in the hour, the last part of the hour, we have a couple of grad students that are going to join us who I guess they spent the day not teaching yesterday. I guess they have
and we'll find out why.
Yeah, we'll find out why they took the day off on the first day of class. They didn't go to work. I guess a lot of people didn't go, but we'll let them tell their story. But first, because we are not speaking on behalf of the University of California and don't want anyone to be confused on that issue, we'll play this.
The following views presented in this hour do not reflect the views of KDVS, KDVS sponsors, or the University of California, Davis.
Our first guest today is Lucien Vanderwalt. He's based at the University of Witwatersrand. Is that right?
Witwatersrand
in Johannesburg. You teach development, economic sociology, and labor studies. The reason I invited you to be on the air with us today is because several months ago I had the opportunity to encounter your book that you co-authored with Michael Schmidt, who's a Johannesburg-based investigative journalist, entitled Black Flame, The Revolutionary Class Politics of Anarchism and Syndicalism.
And I just want to say this is the first time that we've had a live guest from Africa on this program, which is very exciting.
It is a first, and in this instance, it's also, I think, noteworthy. Anarchism is something, I think, in terms of the general public perception and understanding, is something that, in comparison to other political values and ideas, is not well understood and not well defined in the public consciousness. And so for that reason, I wanted to have you on the air today, because for that reason I thought your book was extraordinarily well timed and provides a context for people, I think, to engage the subject and evaluate their own political values in comparison to it. And I enjoyed the book very much for that reason. So thank you for making some time available. And I want to also note that you are up back in South Africa. I think it's 2 a.m., is that right?
Yeah, no, it's around about then. But anyway, thanks for having me on the show. No problem at all.
The first thing I want to kind of ask you is, because it's one of the primary subjects of your book, is sort of a simple question. What is it that you believe to be anarchism, and what, in your view, do you consider to be improperly described as anarchism?
Well, as you know, the whole idea of anarchism, the whole word has gathered a lot of connotations over time, which have obscured people's ability to understand it. I mean, in the public mind, in the States, I imagine it's pretty similar to a lot of other English-speaking countries. Anarchism is seen as chaos, disorder, and so on. But once you get beyond that, there's a whole lot of things that get thrown into a bit of a grab bag called anarchism. Now, when you look closely at anarchism, to understand what its core ideas are, you have to look at its history, you have to look at when it emerges. And when you look at its emergence, we have to go back to the 1860s. We find it emerging in the union movement, the workers' movement, in the socialist movement. So, to answer your question about what we see as anarchism, and this is the central argument in our book, we're to understand anarchism as a movement that aimed, through struggle, to create a free, stateless, socialist society based on cooperation and mutual aid, a movement that sees the motor of history as the struggle of ordinary people, working class people, just ordinary folks, peasants, small farmers, trying to create that world across borders and internationally. That would be the basics of it. A class struggle-based socialist movement, libertarian in its aims, libertarian in its methods, and trying to create a sort of a free, cooperative socialist order. Now, the thing is, anarchism, besides the label of chaos and so on, has been used a lot in the academy, and I think this is one of the problems it faces in its perception as compared to, say, Marxism or liberalism. It's been used in the academy to refer to a whole bunch of quite unrelated doctrines, ranging from the ideas of Max Stirner, who was an extreme individualist, all the way through to various fairly abstruse philosophies around individual autonomy and so on. I don't know, does that answer you?
Well, it just seems to me that with Marxism you have Marx. So
right.
there's this person you can point to with totalitarianism, maybe Hannah Arendt, and so with anarchism, with fascism, Mussolini, and with anarchism there isn't, certainly I don't know, where you exactly point to. You also have in the title of the book syndicalism. Maybe you could define that for us as well.
All right. Before I get onto that, let me say, if we were looking for your Marx and your Engels of anarchism, I think you'd have to look at Mikhail Bakunin, and you'd have to look at Peter Kropotkin. So Bakunin and Kropotkin would be the two main figures. These would be the two key thinkers, the key influences on the movement, the people who really articulate and express and codify a lot of its doctrine. Not to say that they invented everything, they never claimed to. They codified a lot of ideas that were out there, expressed them, acted as a sort of mouthpiece of the movement. Those would be the two big guys, the big two. Now, in terms of syndicalism, by syndicalism, at a minimum, we'd mean the idea of a revolutionary trade union movement. The idea of syndicalism was that you could essentially use trade unions rather than the state, rather than political parties, rather than some small group of guerrillas running around the mountains in berets. Actual unions run by ordinary people in their workplaces to bring about this new anarchist society. So in that sense, syndicalism, the idea of revolutionary trade unionism, is a strategy developed within the anarchist movement, a strategy that was there from the start. So partly because of the connotations attached to anarchism, partly because there is a bit of a tendency in a lot of the literature, a lot of the activist milieu, a lot of the union movement to see syndicalism as something altogether different to anarchism. We've had to single out the word of it there, the anarchism and syndicalism, but we see syndicalism as very much part of a broad anarchist tradition.
Well, it's interesting that Ron brought up this question of syndicalism, because one of the questions I found interesting in the book, there's I think a couple of chapters that address the relationship of anarchism to union movements broadly defined, and here in the United States, basically trade unionism, union movements generally have been facing a great deal of difficulty over the last several decades, and so when I read those passages in the book, one of the things that came to my mind is, are the strategies and tactics associated with anarchism and syndicalism, are they still viable today? And if so, how?
All right. Well, part of the reason which we placed so much emphasis on the unions there was that in the historic anarchist movement, from its emergence back in the 1860s, unions were a central part of its strategy. For most anarchists, syndicalism was the way to go. Not only focusing on unions, but certainly seeing unions as absolutely central. And it's through trade unions that anarchism made many of its biggest impacts historically. For example, you had a situation in Argentina in the 1910s where there were two major union federations. These were the two big centers in the country, and they were both different variants of anarchism and syndicalism. So this is the kind of influence it had in the past. You could imagine what it would be like in the States if, say, the AFL-CIO was an anarchist or a syndicalist federation. But this wasn't actually that uncommon. So the emphasis on unions partly reflects the historical reality in which, certainly into the 20s and 30s, anarchists and syndicalists led, founded, influenced major union federations around the world. The question, though, is how do you actually get back to that? You spoke about strategy and tactics. Well, the strategy of syndicalism is quite straightforward. You run a sort of militant, radical, participatory, democratic, transformative trade unionism. You tie it up to other social movements in communities. You tie it up to social justice issues around, say, racial prejudice and so on. But how do you actually get there? How do you actually get to that position of influence? Now, at one level, the potential is there in that trade unionism, even in the States, continues to be an absolutely central force. And in the States itself, the AFL-CIO is seeing a bit of a turnaround recently with, I think the figure I saw earlier this year was over 1 million new members being recruited. Once you look outside the States, you look at places like Brazil, South Africa, or South Korea, you see trade unionism not just playing a central role, but actually expanding its influence all the time. Okay, but at another level, how do you actually link that to anarchist movements? And this is a very tricky thing. There's a lot of debates on that, and the book gets into a lot of it. I don't claim to have a magical formula here. What I would say, looking historically at anarchism, unions were absolutely critical. Looking at the present, I'd say unions still have that potential to be critical. But how to put those two together, that's a tricky thing, and I think a lot will depend on context, a lot will depend on program, a lot will depend on what people who define themselves as part of an anarchist tradition actually do.
So would it be fair to say that people today that might have a view that unions have become too sclerotic or too difficult to transform, and that anarchism should move in a different direction, would be advocating a perspective that is either misguided or even potentially suicidal?
Well, I think there again we have to look at context. One of the things that has happened during the 20th century was the rise of quite centralized forms of trade unionism. The trade unionism that the anarchists, that the syndicalists looked to, would be a unionism that was very flat, very participatory, a unionism that allowed the development of quite a radical counterculture, a proletarian counterculture. Now, in the 20th century, as unions have become more centralized, more entangled in the state, more tied to political parties, the amount of space in those unions to actually change them seems to often be quite narrow. I mean, if we look at the South African case, we see that while the union's official policy is actually quite far to the left, there's actually not always that much space within the union to contest what that left would mean. So these issues of intolerance and centralism are going to play a critical role. What I would say is, looking at the historical experience, it would be vital to find ways to get an anarchist syndicalist or an anarchist program back into the union. And it won't be easy. That's something that will take a lot of creativity and a lot of activity. Right now, that may not be on the agenda. It may not even be practical for people in a lot of circumstances. Right now, people may be investing their energy better into community organizing, into alternative institution building. But in the longer term, I think it would be absolutely impossible to get that sort of change anarcho-syndicalism or anarchism in general has aimed at without some sort of link into the unions. How exactly to do that, I think it's difficult to be prescriptive, but I think as a strategic objective, it would be absolutely crucial.
It seems that what you've described as the rise of an anarchist philosophy comes in response to the centralization of capital in the emergence of the Industrial Revolution. And here we are now in the age of global capital and centralization of that power with things like the Fortune 500 and global capital can move around so quickly and so easily. Is it really viable? It seems like this is an idea, a philosophy that has never really been able to compete successfully with a more centralized power structure.
Well, I think it's important to bear in mind that Anarchism wouldn't necessarily be opposed to any centralization as such. The question would be, what is the form of centralization that you're aiming at? Now, if you're going to build a movement from below upwards, a movement based on participation, assembly, inevitably you're going to end up having delegates and you're going to end up having coordinating structures. In that sense, anarchism can pose a form of centralization, and I don't think that's a bad thing at all. But it's important that that would be a federalist, non-coercive centralization from below. So I think it can coordinate. Potentially, anarchist movements could coordinate in a way that would be as efficient, but yet far more participatory than the centralization we see on the part of capital and the state. Now, to move on from that, your question around globalization, your question around the rise of large companies and so on, could anarchism pose, could it respond to, could it engage with this new world order? I think the key thing, one of the key points we're trying to make in this book is that anarchism did emerge very much in concrete circumstances that are actually not that different to ours. If you look at the period from the 1880s into the 1920s, 1930s, we're actually talking about a period of very deep globalization, a period in which capital movement internationally, while slower, was at least as extensive as it is today, in which international trade was actually freer than it is these days. So you might think of anarchism as a movement which has got a lot to offer to contemporary anti-globalization or counter-globalization activists, because it operates in the world in its period of greatest influence, the 1880s into the 1920s, that wasn't actually that different to what we have now.
One of the things I find I think that's an important subject is there's a contrast between anarchism and between, I guess the right way to say it would be state socialism or Marxist-Leninism as put into practice. What precisely are the points of contention between that Marxist-Leninism and anarchism in relation to understanding class relationships? And to what extent is anarchism a different model than the state socialist model that was attempted in the 20th century?
I think that this is actually quite crucial. The Marxist tradition, while it's not an homogeneous tradition, the actual organized Marxist movement of the 19th and 20th centuries was one very much dominated by a centralist vision, a vision that got its expression in places like the Soviet Union or the People's Republic of China. And in anarchism's birth, anarchism's emergence in the 1860s, it was very much as a reaction not just against capitalism, not just against the state, but against what the anarchists like Bakunin saw as an incipient, centralized, authoritarian model of state socialism. Now, the differences is at the level of the understanding of society, and there's differences at the level of the vision and the strategy. I want to talk about the vision and the strategy more. Generally speaking, classical Marxism, whether it was in the original Social Democrats or later in its Leninist form, saw the state as the engine of transformation. The basic idea was that you would take over the state, and you would use the state to transform society from above. You would create your socialist citizens from above. Even if people weren't ready, they could be compelled to become ready. The revolution wouldn't necessarily have to move at the speed of the slowest soldier. Rather, the vanguard of the class, at least the self-defined vanguard, would seize power and essentially move to putting socialism from above. Now, the anarchist model was very different from that, whereas Marxism-Leninism stressed the building of a highly centralized, quite militarized party organization with the aim of capturing state power. The anarchist tradition, including syndicalism, stressed a participatory model that was based on participation, that was based on intellectual emancipation, that was based on training people in the here and now to run society in a democratic, participatory way in the future. I mean, this was the idea that your means would have to match your ends. The way you organize now is going to shape what you get in the future. If you build a centralized, militarized party organization aiming to seize central state power and impose socialism from above, you're being perfectly consistent. If, on the other hand, you want to create a democratic, horizontal society, well, you would actually have to start to do that now. Tied to that was the idea in anarchism that if this new society meant anything, it would have to be something that ordinary people created. By definition, you could not impose a free society from above. You can't, as Martin Buber says somewhere, take a young oak sapling, strip off the bark, strip off the leaves, use it as a club, and then later stick it in the ground and hope it's going to turn back into an oak tree. So in terms of stressing a democratic approach, in terms of stressing non-authoritarian approach, in terms of making democracy not a tactic but absolutely central, anarchists broke with what they saw as the tendency in Marxism to sacrifice people to goals rather than seeing people's emancipation as the goal in and of itself.
To me, the intersection between Marxism, anarchism, and capitalism is the Spanish Civil War. Could you explain the dynamics going on there and how that affected the growth of one system over another?
Sure. I just wanted to mention one thing about the relationship between anarchism and Marxism, which plays out in the situation, which is that there's a bit of an overlap. Anarchists do take something from Marxism, and that's above all Marxist economics. So there's a bit of an overlap. We'd be exaggerating if we set them up as entirely separate systems. However, the differences harden over time, especially once you get the rise of the Soviet Union. Now, the Soviet Union, the formation of the Soviet Union from 1917 onwards, is absolutely central to the rise of Marxism in the 20th century. Before then, Marxism is not the sort of mass movement it becomes later. Before then, Marxism is essentially a movement in Europe. It's not a movement that has any real traction in the rest of the world. Once the Soviet Union is established, communist parties have really got a very powerful force in their corner. Now, when you get to Spain, in 1936, essentially there's an attempted military coup. Francisco Franco, who's a general influenced by the ideas of fascism, particularly Mussolini-style fascism rather than Hitler-style Nazism, tries to seize power. He's thrown back by a left coalition, which includes a large anarchist portion, as well as the Spanish Communist Party. Now, civil war breaks out in that, which is why most people remember the event from 36 to 39 as the Spanish Civil War. What happens in the areas where the anarchists are strong is there's a large scale application of the anarchist vision. What I mean here is people self-managing factories, self-managing land, implementing social reforms, trying to implement anarchist vision. But within that left camp, which is fighting against Franco's camp, a civil war starts to break out between the communists and the anarchists. And the Soviet Union's calculation, then under Joseph Stalin, is that a revolution in Spain, which the anarchists are actually doing, has to be stopped. At one level, it would challenge the hegemony that the Communist International is trying to create in the workers' movement. Anarchism in Spain is vastly, vastly more influential than communism. At another level, Stalin, seeing the interests of socialism as equivalent to the interests of the Soviet Union, believes that a revolution there would essentially destabilize the relations he's trying to set up with Britain and France. So what this actually means in practice is, besides the civil war against Franco and his forces, the anarchists find themselves under attack from Stalin's Communist Party in Spain. And by the time that the left liberal coalition, the Republican forces, as they're usually called, are defeated by Franco, the revolution that the anarchists had tried to put in place has already been